Growing up, I heard stories about mythical creatures from old legends. One of those creatures was the tsuchigumo. That's what they called them, giant creatures, similar to spiders, but incredibly smart and cruel. My name is Takumi Sato. I'm 29 years old, and I'm a sergeant second class in the Japan Self-Defense Force. This story happened right after the earthquake that hit the Noto Peninsula on January 1st, 2024. An earthquake that cracked open something that had been sleeping in Japan's underground caves for centuries. By that point, I'd been serving for more than 6 years. Our unit was stationed at a base in central Japan. On January 1st, while the whole country was celebrating the new year, the news reported that a massive earthquake had struck the Noto Peninsula. I was sitting in the barracks and didn't think much of it. Usually when something like that happens, the military gets called in for disaster relief, and I knew orders would come. They came the next morning. On January 2nd, almost the entire base was loading into helicopters. Me and my buddy Daiki Morita got assigned to a 50-man group headed for the city of Suzu. First Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka was in command. The destruction we saw flying in was hard to put into words. The city was about 90% gone. Roads buried under landslides, part of the coastline washed out by the tsunami. Thousands of people had no roof over their heads and nowhere to go. The helicopters touched down on open ground near the city. We unloaded crates of supplies. They told us there were weapons in the crates too, just in case, but they wouldn't be handed out for now. The mission was classified as Humanitarian. We set up camp, tents, command post. A few hours later, the first food shipments arrived. Lieutenant Tanaka gave the orders. Part of the group handled food distribution, the rest went to help rescue teams dig through the rubble. Daiki and I spent hours in the wreckage. In one house, we found a woman pinned under a collapsed wall, and we pulled her out alive. She was crying and gripping my hand so hard that marks were still on my wrist afterward. She asked me if her son was alive, and I didn't know what to tell her, because there was no one else in the rubble beside her. In the next block, we found a kid, sitting alone in the ruins, not saying a word, just staring straight ahead. I picked him up, and he didn't fight it, didn't cry, just kept staring at nothing. Daiki asked him his name, but the boy never answered. We brought him to the school building, which was still partly standing. Dozens of people had already gathered there. Old folks, women with kids, some with no shoes, some in nothing but a shirt in the cold. They set up a relief center, laid out blankets, and a local doctor was checking the wounded right there on the gym floor. We went back into the ruins and kept working. Over the next few hours, we pulled out 2 more. A man with a broken leg and an elderly woman who was unconscious and never came to on the whole way to command. One house we spent too long clearing, and we were too late. The person inside wasn't breathing anymore. Bodies were everywhere. I saw them in the wreckage of houses, under the rubble, in the streets. I tried not to let my eyes linger, because I knew that if I started dwelling on it, I wouldn't be able to keep working. That evening, we returned to our camp. Me and another soldier were put on night watch. The lieutenant issued us weapons to stand post. He said tonight especially we needed to stay sharp, because looting starts after disasters like this, and we had to be ready for anything. At the time, I figured the trouble would come from people. That turned out to be wrong. I took up position at the edge of camp, where I could see both the city and the mountains behind it. Night fell fast. Daiki was on watch too, a little further off by the equipment tents, and every so often I'd catch the glow of his flashlight. The first few hours were quiet, aside from distant sounds. Rocks sliding somewhere in the mountains. Something creaking in the ruined houses on the outskirts. In the middle of the night, I heard a roar. It came from the mountains, low, heavy, like nothing I'd ever heard. I froze and listened, and a few minutes later, the sound came again. Closer this time. Then from the other end of the city came another sound, and right behind it, a woman's scream, short. Cut off so abruptly I wasn't sure I'd really heard it. The camp wasn't put on alert. I reported what I'd heard to the lieutenant. He said it was probably just a scream. People in shock after a disaster scream for all kinds of reasons. And that wasn't reason enough to wake the whole camp. He told me to wait for morning. I went back to my post. In the morning, a woman came to us, older, in torn clothes, her hands shaking as she talked. She said a huge creature had attacked her half-destroyed house on the edge of the city and dragged her husband off. She said she'd seen it with her own eyes. She said it was a tsuchigumo. A few soldiers near me laughed. Lieutenant Tanaka snapped at them hard. He told them to show this woman some respect. She'd survived a disaster, lost her home, and maybe her husband too. And even if shock had made her see things, that was no reason to laugh. Tanaka took a few of us, including me and Daiki, and we walked to the woman's house. She walked ahead of us, and I could see her shoulders shaking with every step. What I saw at that half-destroyed house made me go quiet. Hanging off the wreckage was something that looked like a web. Thick, sticky strands unlike anything I'd ever seen on any insect. Nearby lay large pools of slime, like something enormous had brushed against the wall and left a trail behind. Daiki walked up and nudged one of the strands with the toe of his boot. It didn't tear. I told Daiki the screaming that night hadn't been for nothing. He looked at me and didn't say anything, just gave a slow nod. The ground around the house was covered in prints. Not human, and not animal in any normal sense. Paw prints, a lot of them. Like a creature with more legs than any animal should have. I crouched next to one of the prints and realized my whole hand fit inside it. The lieutenant stood there in silence, studying the tracks. And for the first time I saw on his face that he was rattled too. Not as a commanding officer, but as a person. The tracks led off toward the mountains and vanished among rocks brought down by the landslide. I looked toward the spot where they disappeared and had a feeling this wasn't over. Behind me, the woman was quietly sobbing. One of the soldiers asked the lieutenant what we were going to do about it. And Tanaka said he'd report up the chain and request instructions. But from the tone of his voice, it was clear he had no idea what there was to report. On the walk back to camp, almost nobody talked. I kept thinking about the roar I'd heard that night, and the scream that had cut off so fast. I grew up on stories about the tsuchigumo, and as a kid they were just bedtime tales. Now I was walking on ground where those tales might have left real tracks, and none of us said out loud what we were thinking. Because by then, we were all thinking the same thing. The woman stayed close to the lieutenant all day. Over and over, she begged him to send someone up into the mountains. To look for her husband, or at least his body, at least something. Tanaka listened without a word, and I could see on his face he didn't know how to answer her. Sending a team into the mountains meant pulling people off the rubble-clearing work, and the reasons he'd have to give for doing that were the kind of thing that sounded shameful to say out loud. I told Daiki I'd go myself, if the lieutenant would let me. Daiki said he'd come too. The two of us went to Tanaka and offered to run a short recon. Just follow the tracks, see where they led, and be back before dark. Tanaka stared at us for a long time before answering. He said he'd give us a few hours for the recon, and that if we weren't back before dark, he'd put the whole camp on alert. He issued us weapons and radios and told us not to be heroes. We left the city and started climbing into the mountains, following the tracks we'd seen by the woman's house. At first it was easy going. The tracks were pressed into soft ground, softened by a recent downpour and the aftershocks. Then the ground turned rocky and the tracks disappeared. We circled around for almost an hour, climbing higher the whole time. Daiki walked ahead, eyes on the ground. He pointed at some bushes off to the side of the trail, flattened, snapped, like something heavy had pushed through them. We headed over and picked the tracks back up. The same ones, deep prints from a lot of legs. pressed into the dirt. We followed the trail another 20 minutes or so, and up ahead I noticed something that had no business being on that slope. A fresh crack in the rock, like part of the mountain had broken off and come down recently. The ground around it was torn up, trees knocked flat. That much was clearly from the earthquake, but behind the break, where the slope should have been solid, there was now a black opening, a cave mouth. The landslide had torn it open. The tracks led straight in. Daiki looked at me, and I saw the same thing in his eyes that I was feeling. Fear, mixed with something that wouldn't let either of us turn around and walk away. I radioed camp and reported that we'd found a cave, opened up by the landslide, and that the tracks led inside. Tanaka asked if we were going in. I said yes. He was quiet for a few seconds, then told us to be extremely careful and stay in contact every step of the way. We switched on our flashlights and went in. Inside it was cold, way colder than outside, and the air was thick, damp, reeking of rot. Our flashlight beams lit up uneven walls, patched here and there with moss, and elsewhere with thin strands that looked like spider webs, only thicker and denser than any web I'd ever seen. The cave sloped down and split almost right away. One passage went straight ahead, the other cut off to the side, and I couldn't tell which one to take. We picked the straight one, because the tracks, smeared through slime on the floor, led that way. We kept going deeper into the mountain for maybe 15 minutes, and with every step the passage got wider, and the strands on the walls got thicker. At one point, Daiki stopped and pointed his flashlight up, and I saw the whole ceiling above us was covered in webbing, huge sheets of it hanging down like rotten curtains. Something was moving between them. It took me a second to register what I was looking at, and when the flashlight beam swept higher, I saw a cocoon wrapped in those strands, about the size of a person. I didn't bother asking Daiki if he'd seen the same thing. We just kept moving, faster now, trying not to think about what was inside that cocoon. The passage opened into a chamber, a massive space hollowed out inside the mountain, so high the flashlight beam couldn't even reach the ceiling. And there, in that chamber, I saw something I'll never be able to forget for the rest of my life. They were sleeping. Dozens of creatures piled on top of each other and scattered along the walls and in the middle of the chamber. Huge bodies, each one bigger than a bear, with long, bent legs like a spider's tucked underneath them as they slept. Their heads weren't spider heads, elongated, animal-like, with something resembling a maw, and just looking at those heads sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold in the cave. Their sides rose and fell slowly, and the whole chamber was filled with a low, quiet hum of their breathing, like the mountain itself was breathing along with them. Daiki froze up beside me. We didn't say a word to each other, just started backing away, step by step, trying not to make a sound, trying not to think about what would happen if even one of those things woke up. We pulled back into the passage, but in the dark, in a panic, we turned the wrong way. I only realized it a few minutes later, when the walls around us stopped looking familiar, and the passage we were following started to narrow and branch off into new tunnels. Daiki said we were lost. I felt the panic start to rise. We split up for just a few seconds. I turned into one passage. Daiki shouted for me to wait, but I'd already taken a few steps by the time my flashlight beam hit a dead end. And there, in that dead end, the creature was standing, not asleep. This one was even bigger than the ones I'd seen in the chamber, its body nearly brushing the ceiling of the narrow passage, its long legs braced against the walls on either side of me, and its head, animal-like, elongated, with 2 rows of small, unblinking eyes, turned toward me so fast I didn't have time to do anything but open fire. The rifle bucked in my hands, round slamming into the creature's body, and it roared, that same roar I'd heard in the night. Only now it was a few feet away from me, deafening, bouncing off the stone walls until my ears rang. And in that moment, the creature let out a cloud of something into the air, like vapor, pale, almost glowing in the flashlight beam. I breathed it in before I even understood what was happening. Everything around me disappeared. I dropped hard into a rush of light, like I'd been teleported somewhere else. Completely out of nowhere, I found myself in the yard of the house I grew up in. And it was summer, warm, smelling of grass. There was no rifle in my hands, and everything that had just happened a moment ago felt like a distant dream. I turned and saw my mother. She was sitting on the porch, watching me ride my bike around the yard, and everything around us was glowing with a strange light. Every leaf on the tree, every blade of grass giving off a soft glow, like the world was made out of something alive, lit from within. Between the trees I saw shapes. Not people, something else, tall animal figures, standing still watching me, and for some reason I wasn't afraid of them at all, even though somewhere deep down I knew I should have been. The vision cut off as sharply as it had started. I came to outside, under the open sky, lying on my back on the cold ground. My head was splitting. Daiki was leaning over me, shaking my shoulder, calling my name. When I finally got my eyes to focus, he told me that after my shots in the cave, all hell had broken loose. The creatures had started waking up, the whole chamber filled with roaring, and the wounded creature I'd shot had bolted off howling into the dark. He said he'd found me passed out in the passage a few seconds after the shots, that the exit turned out to be closer than we'd thought, thank God, and that he'd dragged me almost the whole way out on his back, because I wouldn't come to. I lay there on the ground trying to make sense of what had happened, where the vision ended and reality began, and I couldn't fully believe it. I told Daiki what I'd seen, the yard from my childhood, the light, the shapes between the trees. And from the look on his face, I could tell it sounded to him like the ramblings of a man in shock. But I knew it had been as real as anything I'd ever experienced. We made it back to camp on legs that could barely hold us, and I could hardly talk as I reported to the lieutenant what had happened. Tanaka listened without interrupting, and I watched his face change with every detail. From disbelief to something close to fear that he was trying hard not to show. I told him these creatures matched the old tsuchigumo legends far more closely than anyone would believe, that there were dozens of them, that they were sleeping in a chamber inside the mountain, and that now I believed that woman. That evening, Lieutenant Tanaka gathered the entire unit and handed out weapons to everyone. No exceptions, including the ones who'd only been on food distribution duty. He said that after what Daiki and I had told him, he wasn't willing to gamble with anyone's life, and that tonight, every single person needed to be ready to open fire if they saw anything out of the ordinary. I heard some of the soldiers talking among themselves, not fully buying what was happening, but most of them stayed quiet. Rumors about the cave and the creatures inside it had already spread through the whole camp. We slept in shifts, taking turns, but I couldn't sleep at all. I lay in the tent, straining to hear into the dark, and every stray sound made my whole body tense up. It happened well past midnight. First there was one sound, a distant roar from the mountains, the same one I'd heard 2 nights running. Then it came again, and almost right away a second voice joined it, then a third. Within seconds the roaring wasn't just coming from the mountains anymore. It was coming from the edge of the city too, and now it sounded like a whole crowd of creatures roaring at once. The lieutenant put the whole camp on alert. I'd never seen people move that fast. Tents emptied out in seconds. Weapons grabbed on the run. Tanaka was shouting orders, and his voice was sharper than I'd ever heard it. He ordered us to move into the city in a tight formation, no spreading out, and to shoot any creature we laid eyes on without hesitation. We ran into the city, and knew right away we were too late. The streets were a nightmare. I saw them immediately. Dozens of huge shapes on long, bent legs, tearing between the ruined houses. They were grabbing people, the few still out on the streets that night, the ones who'd run out of their tents and makeshift shelters at the sound of the roaring. I heard a scream off to my left and turned toward it, but I wasn't fast enough. A creature dragged the screaming person around the corner of a house before I even got my weapon up. We opened fire. I shot at the nearest creature, aiming for the body, and it roared in pain but didn't go down. It just spun toward me, and for a second I saw its animal face right up close, soaked in blood, and I understood I could die right there, on that street, among the wreckage of a city that wasn't even mine. Daiki was next to me, yelling at me to fall back to the wall, and the two of us backed away together, still firing. The creatures turned out to be smarter than I expected from any animal. Some of them avoided the open ground where it was easier to get a clean shot, hid behind piles of rubble, attacked from around corners. One of them, hit by a burst of gunfire, retreated into a dark alley instead of charging us, like it had weighed its odds and decided not to risk it. That scared me more than their sheer size did. The fight went on for maybe 20 minutes, though it felt like hours. I saw one of our soldiers go down and not get back up, saw a creature at the school, where people were sheltering, tear through a tent with its claws, and I ran over there with a few other guys, firing as we went. We drove it back with heavy fire, and it howled and retreated into the dark between the houses, leaving a trail of blood behind it. At some point, a creature came at me that I hadn't seen in time. It came out of the shadow of a collapsed wall just a few steps away. I managed to fire point blank, and it roared, jerked back, and in that instant a cloud burst out of its mouth, the same glowing vapor I'd seen in the cave. I breathed it in before I could turn away or hold my breath. The world around me vanished again. I found myself on the deck of a ship, out in the middle of the open ocean. The sky overhead was a strange, unnatural color, but beautiful. The water around the ship was thick with fish of impossible size, their backs breaking the surface and slipping back under. And I stood there, gripping the rail, feeling the deck roll beneath me. And at the same time I understood, somewhere at the very edge of my mind, that this place didn't exist, that I was seeing something I'd never seen and could never have seen. But I felt good and calm. The vision cut off just as suddenly as the last one had. I came to in the morning, lying on the side of the road on the edge of the city. The sun was already up, and people were moving around me. Soldiers, rescue workers, locals, all of them with the same frozen, shell-shocked look on their faces. My head hurt so bad, I could barely get my eyes fully open. Someone helped me sit up. The city looked even worse after that night than it had after the earthquake. Several people were missing. Search teams combed the rubble for them and found no bodies, no trace, like they'd just dissolved into thin air. 3 soldiers from our group had been killed. Lieutenant Tanaka called me and Daiki into his command post before noon. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. He asked us to walk him through everything again, every detail. The cave, the chamber full of sleeping creatures, everything we'd seen. He needed to understand what we were dealing with, because he couldn't let a night like that happen again. He said he could request support from higher up, but heavy equipment was next to impossible to get in with the roads wrecked, and trying to explain to command why they needed to run an airstrike on a specific mountain would be next to impossible. Nobody up the chain would believe that creatures out of legend were running loose in an earthquake-flattened city. Instead, he said he could request a large shipment of explosives, officially for clearing road debris after the earthquake, which would be routine enough in a situation like this, and that explosive could be used to bring down the cave entrance and seal the creatures inside, securing the city for good. The shipment arrived by helicopter just a few hours later, close to noon. The lieutenant said we needed to move while it was still light out, while the creatures were most likely asleep inside the mountain, the same way we'd caught them last time, and that going in there in the dark after a night like that would be suicide. He gathered everyone who could hold a weapon, and we headed for the mountains as soon as the shipment was unloaded. I walked at the front of the group. There were a little over 30 of us. We reached the cave entrance while it was still light, moving as quietly as we could. Every sound, a branch snapping underfoot, gear clinking, made me flinch, even with the sun high overhead and everything lit up around us. The combat engineers started placing charges above the entrance, climbing up the mountainside, planning to bring the rock face down so it would completely bury the opening. The work took several hours and dragged on almost until evening. I stood in the perimeter, listening into the darkness of the cave, and I swore I could hear that same low hum of breathing I'd heard in the chamber full of sleeping creatures. Nobody spoke above a whisper. Once the charges were set, they pulled us back to a safe distance, and the lieutenant raised his hand to give the order to detonate. At that exact moment, a creature burst out of the darkness of the entrance with a roar, the same huge one on those long legs, like something inside the cave had woken it up in those exact seconds, and it bolted outside just moments before the blast went off. The explosion was so massive the ground shook under our feet, and the shockwave hit my ears so hard I went completely deaf for a few seconds. The rock face above the entrance came down all at once, burying the opening under tons of stone. Where hours earlier there had been a black hole in the mountainside, now there was a solid wall of rock, like the cave had never existed at all. The creature that had escaped spun around and charged at us with a roar. I watched it come. The huge animal face, the bared jaws, the long legs kicking up dirt with every stride. And in that second, I was sure it was over. But the lieutenant was already shouting the order to open fire, and the whole unit let loose at once. The creature screamed, stumbled, staggered sideways under the hail of bullets, and at the last second, bleeding heavily, it turned and bolted into the darkness of the forest. Tanaka ordered us not to pursue and to fall back to the city immediately. We ran back as fast as we could, and by the time we made it back to the city, I felt something close to relief. Since that night in Suzu, nobody has seen those creatures again. The nights went quiet again, aside from the ordinary sounds of a broken city. We spent 2 more weeks there, helping clear rubble and evacuate the remaining residents, before our unit got reassigned to another sector, and a month later, we were sent back to base. I never heard anything about those creatures again. One of them escaped into the forests on the slopes of Noto, and whether it survived its wounds or died from them, I still don't know to this day. But what I do know for certain is that somewhere under that mountain, under the tons of rock we used to bury the only entrance I ever knew about, those things are still sleeping, the same way they slept before that earthquake ever hit, waiting, maybe for years, maybe for centuries, for the ground to shake again and open the way back out for them. Thanks for your likes, comments, and subscriptions. It really helps the channel grow. See you in the next story.